Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Tonight we have the privilege of listening to Andrea Smith, who began her education at Trent University, where she did a bachelor's. She then moved on to Queen's, where she got her PhD in Evolutionary Biology in 2005. She then worked with Ontario Nature for a little while. Then more recently, she's been working with Norman Yan at York University. She was in his lab for 3 years, something like that. And now she has recently obtained a position as senior research scientist with
some local
firm named Hutchinson Environmental. And I personally am very happy that she got that job because it keeps her in Muskoka and we need all the scientists we can get. And Andrea is going to talk to us about invading species. Aliens amongst us, are we prepared for the invaders? So Andrea, the floor is yours.
So, I'm going to be talking to you about a very exciting topic today. At least my two sons thought it was exciting when they saw the title slide. They were a little bit disappointed to find out that I wasn't actually going to be talking about Martian invasions, and I was going to be focusing more on earthly invaders. But I think that the earthly invaders are a much more pressing topic for us, much more of a threat. So, even though my sons aren't here to listen, I hope that you find it more interesting than talking about space invaders. So, first of all, what am I talking about when I'm referring to invasive alien species? Well, alien species are any species that are introduced beyond their native range by human activity, either intentionally or accidentally. And this can be introductions from another continent, from another country, or within Canada, or even within Ontario. It's just the moving around of species beyond their natural distributions as a result of human agency. Invasive alien species are those alien species who are harmful in some way in their newly invaded habitats. So they may have threats to the environment, economy, or society. Commonly, they have threats to all of these components. And invasive alien species can be plants, they can be animals, they can be microorganisms. So they cause a wide variety of impacts. First of all, most of alien species that are introduced to new areas don't actually go on to cause harmful impacts, but those that do usually have disproportionate and vast effects. And this is because they don't bring with them their natural predators, their natural competitors, natural parasites, and so forth that exist with them in their natural habitats. So this is what biologists refer to as ecological release. So they come from another environment, but they don't bring with them the checks and balances that keep them under control. And in their new environment, they encounter species and ecosystems that haven't evolved in concert with them, so are thus not prepared to deal with their effects. And their effects can be huge. They can modify habitat, they can outcompete native species, they can cause predation and herbivory on native species, and they can bring disease and parasitism. Quite a high proportion of our species at risk are directly impacted by invasive species, so it's around 20% of listed species in Ontario and around 24 to 25% across the country are listed as species at risk partly because of invasive species. And then the environmental impacts that invasive species have ultimately affect the ecosystem services that we rely on, such as nutrient cycling, erosion and flood control, and seed dispersal. So the economic impacts have been much harder to quantify. There aren't really very many comprehensive studies that have been done to get at the full cost of invasive species to the economy. But preliminary studies show that they can be quite significant. So a 2006 study in Canada looked at 10 invasive species and their impact on the agricultural, forestry, and fisheries sectors, and found that there was roughly a $187 million a year cost in terms of damages and control, just for these sectors alone. The same study then factored in what it called the invisible tax of lost yields of natural resources, and this time looked at 16 invasive species and came up with a conservative estimate of between 13 and about $34 billion a year in terms of losses to the natural resource sector. Now, to put this in perspective, they only looked at between 10 and 16 invasive species currently in Canada, and there are around 1,500 that we know about. So these are probably vast underestimates of the impacts economically that invasive species have. In the United States, it's been estimated that economic costs are around $120 billion a year, and globally around $1.4 trillion. So they're significant. But their effects don't stop there, so they have impacts on human health. We can think of West Nile or Lyme disease. We can think of the effects of giant hogweed and its very toxic effects on the skin and eyes. And of course, there are sociocultural impacts as well. So invasive species affect our appreciation of nature and our cultural practices and recreational activities like hunting and fishing and other activities related to nature appreciation. They also impact spirituality. So many people have a strong affinity to the natural environment, and if invasive species are vastly modifying it, then this connection, this spiritual connection with nature, is going to be affected. So invasive species arrive in new areas as a result of many pathways and vectors. So pathways are the actual routes that invasive species travel along to get to new places, and vectors are the actual vehicles or agents that carry them along these routes. So you can think of an example for a pathway is the international shipping pathway, bringing ships to Canada, and within that shipping pathway, ballast water within the tanks of these ships could be considered a vector. So we can have accidental pathways and vectors such as bringing hitchhikers in ballast water, as I mentioned, or on the hulls of ships, in our luggage, and in packaging and wooden crates that bring in trade material. We can also have intentional introductions, for instance, for gardening, for food, and for the aquarium trade. And then once the species are in Canada, they can then be spread a multitude of ways. Some common ways for aquatic species, for instance, are through recreational boating, and for terrestrial species, you can think of invasive beetles being carried in firewood. So invasive species have been termed self-regenerating pollution, but unlike other types of pollution, they have a number of unique challenges that make them particularly difficult to tackle. One of these is the fact that there are many potential and existing invasive species to deal with that are entering and spreading through numerous pathways and vectors, and they're invading every type of habitat in marine, terrestrial, and freshwater ecosystems. So this makes it difficult to really get a handle on managing all of these species as a group. And then predicting what species are going to be the next invasive species has proven to be extremely difficult as well. And many invasive species exhibit a lag time between their introduction and when we first observe their impacts. And so in the meantime, they may be increasing in population numbers and in geographic extent, and we're completely unaware of them until they've become established and have spread to the extent that they are now very difficult to manage, control, and eradicate. And then we have the lovely invasional meltdowns, which are essentially when different invasive species interact with each other so that the whole is greater than the sum of their parts. And one example of this is zebra mussel and Eurasian water milfoil. So zebra mussel improve water clarity, making the freshwater habitat more favorable for milfoil. Milfoil then spreads and provides additional habitat for zebra mussel. And so it's a positive feedback loop, which is very difficult to break once it's underway. And this just illustrates a couple of examples of lag time in some invasive species. So Japanese knotweed, mugwort, and Norway maple. And you can see that for sometimes decades, the spatial extent and population numbers were extremely low. So nobody was thinking they'd be a problem. And then suddenly, they just explode and take off in the landscape. And biologists are really grappling with what is it that causes this lag time and then this sudden explosion that we see in many invasive species. And they haven't really gotten a good handle on it yet. But that's not all. So in a sense, we're creating a perfect storm of conditions for invasive species. So our global trade and travel and tourism continues to escalate, providing ongoing pathways and vectors for invasive species. We continue to grow in population, and we continue to destroy habitat for development, to fragment habitat. All of this disturbance makes natural habitats more susceptible to invasions. And then we have climate change thrown into the mix, which as well opens up many new pathways for invasive species to get to new areas. And also, once they get to these new areas, provides greater probability that they're going to actually survive and thrive in these new habitats. So the key is that prevention is the best option, because as time goes on from the time of first introduction of an invasive species, the management costs go up and the management success, or the chance of management success, goes down. So if you look here, we see, for instance, this is when an introduction occurs. And so the species is at a relatively low number. Eradications should be fairly simple. But this is when invasive species are typically detected by biologists and managers. So they've become more established, they've spread out into scattered locations. Their eradication is still feasible, but it may be a little more challenging than when they first came in, because they're no longer localized in population and in distribution. But this is what I found really interesting, is that public awareness typically begins when they're already established and spread across the landscape. And so we've already missed many chances to eradicate them. And we're usually left with dealing with long-term management through control and population suppression. But chances of eradication have become much more difficult. So as I said, prevention should be the priority, but of course it's not always going to be 100% effective. And so we have to be ready to address the other stages of the invasion process as well. So we have early detection, which is the early warning system that we have to have in place so that we are able to detect those early introductions of species before they have risen in number and in spatial extent. And early detection then leads to rapid response, so that we rapidly respond to trying to get rid of the invasive species at this early stage, when, if you think back to the previous graph, chances of success are much higher than later on. And then once a species has become established and has spread to more locations, our options switch to long-term management, so eradication is less likely to be successful, although we shouldn't completely rule it out, but it's more probable that we have to switch to thinking of containing and controlling species on the landscape. So I'm going to talk about each of these stages in a little bit more detail. So prevention consists of typically identifying and assessing the species that are threats, the pathways and vectors that they're going to move along, and the key entry points or vulnerable areas that are likely to be invaded first. And with this information, we can develop lists of species that are unwanted that we want to prohibit from entering our jurisdiction. We can also regulate activities that might involve those species, so maybe banning their trade or possession of those species. And we can have tools such as permits and licenses to use for activities that might increase the likelihood of introducing and spreading these species as well. For instance, the shipping pathway, or having import permits for the pet trade. And then ideally we want to have inspectors on the ground who are at these key entry points and at vulnerable areas on the landscape, so that they can intercept and isolate any invasive species when they are detected. Early detection then, as I said, was the early warning system, and it consists, a well-planned early detection system consists of ongoing monitoring, so that we're able to find the species early on and be monitoring the high-risk pathways and vectors, as well as the hot spots and hot times. So some species might be more likely to invade at certain times of year. You can think of spiny water flea is obviously more of a threat in the summer than in the winter, so it would make sense to focus our monitoring at that time of year. And then there needs to be a system in place to be able to quickly notify experts and response teams to get them working to move into the rapid response stage. And rapid response really relies on a number of key factors. First of all, a readiness to act and the resources and funding in place for immediate action. So one of the things that I've recently done a jurisdictional scan of what a number of North American jurisdictions are doing in terms of invasive species prevention and managing. And one thing that came up many times was the fact that they may be ready to act, but they just don't have the funding available, and the funding cycle might take a year before they have it available, and obviously that's not ideal for a rapid response to an invasive species. So then a rapid response process would typically also include identifying and assessing the extent of the threat, determining what its impacts are going to be, and determining the feasibility of response. So it might be decided that it's just not going to, there's not going to be a high likelihood of eradicating this species, so we're not going to put our efforts into trying to do so. And then evaluating, well, if eradication isn't possible, are there other options available? And then deciding, after all of that evaluation, whether you're going to act. Ideally, you will be able to. And then just quickly reviewing the long-term management. So once the species are established, we shift to trying to limit their size and limit further spread. There may be a number of options available depending on the species, including physical, such as manual removal of vegetation, chemical, such as herbicides and pesticides, and biological options. So actually introducing other species that might attack the invasive species as parasites or predators to lower their impacts. The challenge with long-term management options is that there's often no precedent, so we don't know what tools are going to work because they might not have been tried elsewhere. So often managers are kind of working in the dark, not sure what's going to work. And if all else fails, we can always eat them. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and switch to looking at how well we're actually addressing invasive species in Canada and Ontario. So as I hope you would agree, because of the complicated aspects of invasive species, we really need a strategic approach to preventing and managing them. We can't be taking a reactive, ad hoc approach to dealing with them. And so the federal and Ontario government, as well as other provincial and territorial governments across the country, have recognized the need for strategies and have been developing them over the past decade. So we have the national strategy, which was introduced 10 years ago, and the provincial strategy just 2 years ago. And these cover a number of different components, including risk assessment, monitoring, research, communication, leadership, and coordination. But the two components that I'm going to be focusing on are legislation and regulation and public awareness and stewardship. So these are important components of any strategy. Legislation and regulation can form a framework of rules to help support invasive species management. And public awareness and stewardship is key because it communicates the nature and magnitude of the problem to the public. It can help raise awareness, raise concern, raise motivation for the public to want to help solve the problem, encourage behavioral change when the public is undertaking activities that might be promoting the spread of invasive species, and can also encourage the public to lobby government and policymakers to strengthen legislation and policy to more effectively address invasive species. So federally in Canada, we have no single overarching legislation to address invasive species, but they are covered in a number of other acts, none of which is specifically focused on invasive species. So we have the Canada Shipping Act, which looks at ballast water and requires that any ships coming from international waters into Canada must undergo some form of ballast water management. We have the Fisheries Act, which has a number of provisions, the main one of which is prohibitions on listed live invasive fish. So currently I think there are 9 listed species which cannot be possessed live. The Plant Protection Act covers plant pests and prohibits their import and spread. The Seeds Act covers noxious weed seeds and prohibits their import. But there are some gaps in each of these acts. So the Canada Shipping Act does not address domestic movement of ships. So ships could be moving from different waterways across the country and be carrying ballast and emptying ballast and be a major vector for the spread of invasive species. But there are no regulations on ballast water management in those cases. And hull fouling, which is another major vector of invasive species, is not covered by the Canada Shipping Act. So many invertebrate species and aquatic plant species can attach to the hulls of ships and be carried long distances to be introduced in new locations. The Fisheries Act does not list a number of species that are invasive. So as I mentioned, there are just 9 invasive fish currently listed. And a big glaring hole is that it doesn't address aquatic invasive plants. Plant Protection Act also doesn't address any aquatic pests, and the Seeds Act is entirely an agricultural focus. So it's not looking at the impacts of noxious weed seeds on biodiversity per se. Similarly, in Ontario, there is no single act that focuses on invasive species, but there are a number that cover them in some capacity. So the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act covers live invasive fish that are listed, and there are 7 currently in the regulations, and trade in these species is prohibited. The Weed Control Act covers noxious weeds and requires their destruction on property. And the Pesticides Act has exemptions to the pesticide ban to allow for the control of invasive species. But there are gaps in these acts as well. So Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act is missing species. For instance, a number of invasive fish that are present in adjacent jurisdictions are not listed under the Fish and Wildlife regulations. The Weed Control Act only applies to agricultural and horticultural lands. And the Pesticides Act involves a lengthy approval process, so it's not ideal if someone was wanting to use pesticides to deal with infestation of invasive species on their property. So the take-home message here is that really across Canada, I've used Ontario as an example, but it's really a similar case in other territories and provinces. There's no overarching comprehensive act that is dealing with invasive species. Instead, there are a hodgepodge of acts that deal with them, many incidentally, often as an afterthought. And so what this means is that across the country, there's no systematic ban on a number of key activities that spread invasive species, namely the import, the possession, the trade, the transport, and the release of invasive species. This patchwork of laws also means that you might have an invasive species that is prohibited in one jurisdiction, and across the border, it is freely available and completely unregulated. And as we know, invasive species don't respect political boundaries. So the current situation is not ideal. But there are some promising developments. So in 2012, there were amendments made to the Federal Fisheries Act to allow the development of aquatic invasive species regulations. And these regulations would enable prevention, management, and control activities, and would allow prohibitions on the import, possession, transport, spread, and release of listed species. We've been waiting for these regulations to actually be implemented, and it doesn't look like they're going to be implemented anytime soon, but at least they're being considered, and we're moving in the right direction. In Ontario, some of you may have been aware of the proposed Invasive Species Act, which was introduced last winter, but which unfortunately died when the spring election was called. If it had been passed, it would have been the first of its kind in Canada, and it was proposing quite comprehensive regulation of invasive species. So it would have classified invasive species depending on their level of threat. So there would have been significant and moderate threat listings. And then depending on that classification, there would have been different degrees of prohibition on the species. Prohibitions would include import, possession, and other key activities. The proposed act also included provisions for early detection and rapid response, as well as control. So what I've heard from people at M&R is that they're quite optimistic that it will be reintroduced in the next year or so in some form, because there was wide political support across all parties for it. So we'll wait and see. So moving on to public awareness of invasive species. The general picture in Canada seems to be that the public is not sufficiently aware of the true nature of the threat, both in terms of the ecological and economical consequences. Now, if you look at invasive species coverage in national newspapers over a 14-year period, so from 1990 to 2004, you might think that public awareness is increasing. And this covers the number of articles with invasive species in the headlines from national newspapers across the country. So it looks pretty promising. If you put it into a different perspective, though, when you look at coverage of the 5 major threats to biodiversity in newspapers from 2009 to 2013 across the country, invasive species are really not getting much attention. If you know where to look, however, there are a wide array of resources available to the public on invasive species prevention and stewardship activities. So one of the key resources in Ontario, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, is the Ontario Invading Species Awareness Program. And this has developed out of a partnership between the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters and the Ministry of Natural Resources. The partnership was formed in 1992, and since then they have continued to develop resources on invasive species, including workshops to educate the public, distribution maps, elementary curriculum for grades 4 and 6, fact sheets on species, guides for landowners for controlling invasive plants. They have a hotline that you can phone if you want to report a sighting of invasive species or want information about invasive species. They have the early detection and distribution mapping system, which is a communication and reporting tool for the public to contribute to and to consult for information on the distribution and spread of invasive species. Another useful resource is the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, and they have developed a number of guides for the public. They have the very useful non-invasive, Grow Me Instead, non-invasive plant guide for gardening. They have landowner guides, guides for industry on cleaning equipment. They offer workshops. They have fact sheets as well. So these are just a couple of examples in Ontario of stewardship initiatives available to involve the public. So they're doing a good job, but invasive species is still not really on the radar in the broader public sphere. And so why is this? I think it's for a number of reasons. Some of these have to do with the challenges that I raised at the beginning of the talk. So the sheer volume of species that are implicated, the pathways and vectors, and the habitats that are affected. The fact that we have no clearly identifiable targets that we're working towards when we're tackling invasive species. So unlike with climate change, for instance, we don't have a 2-degree ceiling that we talk about with invasive species. And often the impacts of invasive species are not immediately noticeable. The impacts also may be spread among many stakeholders instead of concentrated with a few groups. And people have different views on what's invasive. So one person's invasive plant may be another person's beloved garden beauty. So all of these things, I think, contribute to the fact that the message is really diluted for the public. And this is an ongoing challenge with public outreach. I wanted to briefly touch on invasive species in Muskoka, and I'm sure I'm talking to an audience that already knows most of this information, but of course Muskoka is not immune to the threats of invasive species. Compared with some other areas, such as southern Ontario, we've been relatively unscathed. So far we have a handful of invasive species, but of course there are many more on our doorstep. And the ones that are here are severely impacting our watersheds. So you're probably familiar with the spiny water flea, for example, which is being much studied in Muskoka, and we know that it is spreading rapidly. It's causing drastic results to our native zooplankton biodiversity and cascading effects on up the food web to affect fish populations. It's also a problem for recreational fishing and other activities. And another example of a major threat for Muskoka is beach bark disease, which is expected to affect 90 to 95% of our beech trees in the region. So I didn't want to leave you with only doom and gloom. I do have a few good news stories to discuss. One of these has to do with the ballast water regulations. So these were introduced as mandatory regulations in 2006. And as I mentioned before, they are mandatory for all ships entering Canadian waters that are carrying ballast. Along the St. Lawrence Seaway, there is 100% inspection of ships entering the seaway from overseas, and there's been a 96% compliance rate, so that's pretty amazing. So since 2006, there have been no new aquatic invasive species to the Great Lake Basin that can be attributed to ballast water. And I think this is a major accomplishment because before 2006, ballast water was the leading cause of the introduction of aquatic invasive species to Canada. So it is possible to turn the tide on invasive species. And I think this illustrates the value of strong regulation coupled with strong enforcement and strong industry buy-in. So the shipping industry has been very cooperative. Also, before the mandatory regulations were developed, the shipping industry had developed their own voluntary guidelines that were being widely applied. So this is a good news story. Another good news story in Ontario is to do with purple loosestrife. So purple loosestrife is one of the most invasive plants in Canada, and it takes over wetlands, it crowds out native plants, and it diminishes wildlife habitat. The Ministry of Natural Resources has had a biocontrol program going on since 1992 in the province, in which they're using 2 species of leaf-eating beetles that are native predators of purple loosestrife in its native range. They were introduced into the province after much study to make sure that they were not going to have negative impacts on native species or habitats. And they've caused an 80% reduction in loosestrife populations where they've been introduced. And then they have also seen a reestablishment of native plants. So many people just assumed that purple loosestrife faded away and were unaware that this control program was ongoing for the last 20 years. And so that is an example of a program that has worked. So in conclusion, I hope I've convinced you that legislation, public awareness, and stewardship are all essential tools in tackling invasive species. I hope I've demonstrated that the current legislation that we have really lacks teeth, and that public awareness is generally low, but not for lack of effort. And I think that there is it seems like the tides are turning in terms of political will towards addressing invasive species. I think the federal aquatic invasive regulations and the Ontario proposed Invasive Species Act are encouraging signs that government is really willing to take action on invasive species. And so, of course, there are many things that you can do to get involved in being part of the solution instead of the problem. If you're using ATVs or boats and trailers, you should always clean, drain, and dry them before moving them to different places. If you have aquarium or water garden species, you should never let them loose into the environment. Don't move firewood, plant native or non-invasive plants. become involved in the citizen scientist monitoring programs that are out there to track the occurrence of invasive species and help with early detection and rapid response. Support invasive species legislation when it is reintroduced, and spread the word, not the species. Thank you very much.
You talked about trying to identify future invasive species. Who's responsible for that, and how do you determine that? And, like I'm thinking in particular of an oak tree apparently that's growing in France near Rennie Ridge, and some soldier had brought back acorns, and someone has been very carefully planting these and growing them, and they're now talking about planting them in Ottawa and planting them at various cenotaphs and as a memory of the war. But my immediate thought was, has anybody looked into this, and are there other things going on like that, and just how do they determine that these are indeed safe?
Well, it would, so any species that's going to be imported into the country would have to get an import permit through the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So they are conducting risk assessments, but they can't obviously do them for every single species. They just don't have enough resources or staff to do that. So they are choosing priority species to focus on, and they rely on information from other jurisdictions. So if the species has an invasion history somewhere else, that would factor into determining whether it can be let in. But the major problem with most species is there just isn't the data out there to know whether it's going to be invasive. And so we have the lack of species being studied, but even when they are studied, it's very hard to predict and say, oh yes, this species is a good candidate for becoming invasive, because species that we might think would have become invasive don't, and species that we wouldn't have thought would be invasive do. So while there are some common traits that can be found among some invasive species, it's not always 100% guarantee of it being invasive. So it's a combination of government agencies are doing risk assessments, and biologists are doing studies, but there's not enough being done to keep up with the wave of species.
But it's also a responsibility of every individual to make sure that they're not transporting things on themselves. And
Exactly, yeah.
Peter, were you working on getting your hand up?
I was going to ask the question of the whole issue of distinguishing between invasive species that you don't want and species that are moving in because the climate is changing. And we're going to have to welcome the latter, because the species that lived before the climate changes are presumably moving somewhere else. So there's a difficult issue there between deciding when it's an invader and when it isn't. And there's also a lot of hysteria. I thought there was a point you made about how not every species that enters becomes damaging. But there's a tremendous, on the one hand, there's a complete lack of awareness and concern, but on the other hand, there's a tremendous tendency for people who are aware to immediately assume that everything is going to be disaster when a new species appears. And so how do you counteract those things and get a more rational approach to a changing biota?
That's tough. So yeah, clearly climate change is going to challenge our definition of native and invasive. I mean, climate change might lead to the introduction of species that don't cause problems. but it's also leading to problems like the mountain pine beetle spreading east. So, yeah, that's a hard one to grapple with. I think if it causes harm, then it's still invasive, and we can decide if we want to do something about it or not. And then in terms of your other point that not all species are going to be a problem and that there might be some hysteria about it. I haven't really come across that so much as people not really being aware of the problem. So I guess I would be more inclined to err on the side of caution than.
Yeah,
But,
Andrew, you mentioned eradication. Are there any examples of how people have eradicated an aquatic invasive species? Has it been effective? How did they do it? Or do we simply have to try to prevent and manage what gets here to limit its spread?
Well, they thought they had eradicated zebra mussel in Manitoba, but then it came back, so that wasn't.
How did they do that?
So they added. They added something to the lake.
They changed the pH or something?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think they lined it, didn't they?
Time to acidified it.
Yeah.
The villagers don't like low pH.
Anyway, they. So it wasn't ultimately successful. Offhand, I can't think of any examples of.
there are good examples of control.
Yeah.
But eradication is really much bigger challenge.
One thing that actually we came across in the literature search, in the jurisdictional review, was that successful eradications may not make it to the literature because managers are not paid to be writing papers. They're being paid to manage the species. So, I mean, it's kind of anecdotal, but there may be examples out there at a small scale of managers managing things, and we just don't know about them.
I'm thinking of a conversation with Norm when he talked about New
Oh,
Zealand
in New Zealand, that's right.
isolated a harbor and poisoned everything in it to get rid of the invader,
Yes.
and then let the natural flora or fauna reintroduce itself.
That's true. I think that was some kind of invasive snail that they were dealing
Okay.
with. And that is true. So in New Zealand, they completely isolated this lake. It was a small, or no, I guess it was just part of the lake. I can't remember. But they were able to completely eradicate it. Yeah.
What were some of your examples of control, Peter?
Peter, can you have any examples of control?
I was
Besides-
thinking of old ones. I was thinking, I mean, prickly pear cactus was a huge problem in Australia in the 30s. I mean, you know the cactus I mean. It occurs in southern Ontario, a little tiny plant. Well, it was growing 6 and 8 feet tall. I've seen photographs of cattle unable to graze because the fields were just growing up with these cactuses that nobody ate. And they successfully brought in a beetle. The same thing as with the purple loosestrife. They brought in a beetle from the home range in South America. And the beetle lays its eggs on the cactus and the larvae eat the cactus. But what happens is the cactuses never disappear. There are little cactus that grow up a little bit and they get big enough and then they get zapped by beetles. And the beetles kind of hang around in low numbers and the cactus hang around in low numbers. That seems to be the best we can do in most cases because we don't discover their escaped. We don't discover they're there until they become so abundant.
Yeah.
But it's like the spiny water flea, I was talking to Dorian about that, and I said, are there any things you can do once it gets into a lake? He said, no.
No.
He said, all you can do is try and keep it out. But once it gets in,
Yeah.
we're basically, we don't have any tools to get rid of it.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the case in the Galapagos where they were eradicating goats, and I'm not sure if I think they successfully got
Yeah.
rid of them, but it was pretty difficult undertaking.
Yeah, if you got things like islands where you can really kind of control the whole thing, it's some
Easier.
possibility.
Goats are much easier to see than spiny water fleas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Larger mammals are beautiful.
Yes.
But there's, I think there's another issue here. We're far less aware of most of what's around us than we could be, and then perhaps we used to be. I mean, I don't think there's many people in Muskoka who know much about the spiny water flea. If they're fishermen, they've seen it. But if they're not fishermen, they're not aware of it, and we're in the lakes all the time. And it has to be making substantial changes to a food web in the lakes.
Well, I must admit, I was at the district councillors all candidates meeting in Bracebridge this week, and at the end, one of the candidates said, you know, they had 3 minutes to bring up anything that nobody else had asked him about. He said, well, nobody asked me about water quality, and I'm very concerned about the biodiversity because we have spiny water fleas that are destroying our biodiversity. I said, what? Wow, I'm impressed. I don't think I'll vote for him, but I was impressed.
Who was it?
Yeah, Joey Grabby,
Oh, okay.
who owns a water taxi.
Oh.
So he's on the water, and he could see that the biodiversity was going.
Yeah, I would think that one of the biggest problems is just identifying, I mean, if there are 1,500 invasive species here in Canada, I'd be hard pressed to come up with a dozen, and I couldn't necessarily identify them, and I think that's a big problem. Like, somebody contacted me about what they thought was the common reed, what's the name? Phragmites. You know, and I went up to take a look at this stuff, but it, you know, with the descriptions I had, it kind of looked like, well, some features made it look like the native one, and some made it look like the invasive species, and, you know, I have been doing all kinds of research online, and still, I can't tell you for sure what this is. I'm just thinking at this point it's probably non-invasive, but for somebody who's, you know, not been at meetings like this and haven't been to water council meetings and that sort of thing, they don't even know what an invasive species is other than the few that have hit the newspapers.
And that are very visible, like purple loosestrife is
Yeah.
pretty easy to see, pretty easy to identify.
Yeah, and like I've mentioned to neighbors even about not transporting firewood from the city, and they said, oh, why not? And there's been so much publicity out there. So it's a really difficult problem we face, is getting people to be even just aware that there are lots of invasive species and that some of these reasons are there for a purpose. And, you know, they go to the garden centers demanding certain plants because they like them.
Yeah.
And the garden centers are kind of more inclined, some of them are anyway, to stock it because people buy it. And I see that as a big issue.
That's where legislation could be helpful. Yeah, you know, if it was banning some of these plants that are sold at nursery centers, that would be a
Yeah, it would be good
easy
help.
way to.
In terms of
Get rid
banning
of the
people
system.
cutting firewood at their cottage and dragging it down to the city, it's like
Yeah.
2 big trailers and 400 yesterday. And it's like filled with firewood.
I'd rather than going south and coming
Well, I
north.
know.
Well, you see whole logs going south, that's.
Yeah, I mean, that's the
Different
beach
yeah.
part going south.
They're not cutting it up north anymore, down south.
Well, most of the problem, I think, is coming north.
Mhm.
Well, it depends on what you're looking at. We don't want their emerald ash borer, but they don't want our beach park.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
yes,
So,
that's true.
anyway, I'd like to thank Andrea. It wasn't a large crowd, but it was a very interesting
Enthusiastic.
enthusiastic crowd. I learned a lot, and it was very well done. Thank you very much. And we have just a little token of our appreciation. The boys will like it, I'm sure. Yeah. Or you can hide it, and the boys don't get any of it.
Put it all in one
Your
thing.
desk drawer.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Stuart.